In 390 BC, Rome was not yet the mighty capital most people imagine today. It was a growing settlement, still vulnerable, still developing, and far from the center of the world it would eventually become. Then disaster came. Gallic warriors entered the city and sacked it, leaving buildings burned and Rome in ruins. For a city of such modest beginnings, this could have been the end, but it was not. Over the centuries that followed, Rome would transform itself into something almost unimaginable. A city of more than 1 million people surrounded by enormous temples, crowded apartment buildings, massive arenas, sprawling markets, and aqueducts carrying water across the countryside. It would become the heart of an empire stretching across 3 continents, and when Rome reached its peak, it was not simply a large ancient city. It was a city operating on a scale that would not be seen again in Europe for many centuries. To understand just how extraordinary that was, it helps to begin at the center of Roman power. The Roman Forum was not simply an open plaza surrounded by old ruins. At the height of Rome, this was one of the most important political spaces in the world. Temples, monuments, public buildings, and speaking platforms crowded the area, and decisions made here could affect people living hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. At the Curia, the Senate House, senators gathered to debate laws and matters of state. The Senate represented an older Roman political tradition, one that survived even as emperors gradually accumulated more authority. Here, politics was not an abstract idea. It was something conducted in stone buildings, public squares, ceremonies, speeches, and confrontations. And only a short distance away stood the rostra, the speaker's platform. This was where public speech could become political power. One of the most famous moments associated with the rostra came after the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Caesar had been murdered by conspirators who believed that killing him would save the Roman Republic from becoming a dictatorship. Instead, his death unleashed another crisis. According to ancient sources, Mark Antony stood before the Roman crowd and displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga. He also read from Caesar's will, revealing that Caesar had left money and gardens to the Roman people. Whatever the exact words of Antony's speech may have been, its effect was enormous. The crowd became so emotional that Caesar's body was cremated in the Forum itself. Later, a temple to Julius Caesar was constructed on that site. Caesar was then formally deified, becoming the first Roman to receive such an official divine status. The place where a political murder had taken place had become a place of worship. It was a perfect illustration of Roman history. Politics could become religion, military victory could become political legitimacy, and the memory of one man could reshape the entire state. But the Forum had another sacred presence, one far quieter than the speeches and political struggles that surrounded it. Near the center stood the Temple of Vesta, a small circular sanctuary protecting a flame that Romans believed had to remain burning. The flame was tended by the Vestal Virgins, women who served for 30 years and were required to remain chaste during their service. Their position was unusual in Roman society. They possessed privileges unavailable to most Roman women, including the ability to own property and, in certain circumstances, intervene on behalf of prisoners. Their importance was not merely religious. They represented the safety and continuity of Rome itself. The belief was simple and terrifying. If the sacred flame went out, Rome's fortunes could go with it. For centuries, the Senate, the temples, the rostra, and the sacred flame existed within this relatively concentrated area. This single part of the city contained politics, religion, public memory, and the machinery of power. But the people who stood at the top of Roman society did not necessarily live among the crowds below. Above the Forum rose Palatine Hill, where the world of the emperor began to take shape. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, established the imperial tradition here. His residence, the Domus Augusti, was comparatively modest when measured against what later emperors would build, but its importance was not measured by size. It marked the beginning of a new political world. Rome was no longer simply a republic dominated by competing aristocratic families. The emperor and his household had become the center of an increasingly personal system of power. Later emperors expanded the Palatine into an enormous palace complex. Under Domitian, the imperial residence became something far grander. The Domus Flavia provided enormous ceremonial spaces where the emperor could receive foreign rulers, hold state banquets, and display the wealth of Rome. Some rooms had ceilings rising roughly 30 meters above the ground. The message was unmistakable. Anyone entering these spaces was not simply visiting a wealthy man. They were entering the physical world of the Roman emperor. Beside these ceremonial areas were more private spaces, including the emperor's personal residence, gardens, courtyards, bedrooms, and baths. In other words, the imperial palace effectively had two personalities. One side existed to impress, the other existed to live. And then there was another extraordinary feature, the emperor's private stadium. Around 160 meters long, it gave the imperial family a place to watch athletic contests and other forms of entertainment without leaving the palace complex. Yet even that private stadium looked small compared with what stood below the hill. At the foot of the Palatine stretched the Circus Maximus, the largest entertainment venue in ancient Rome and one of the largest gathering places of the ancient world. More than 150,000 spectators could gather there to watch chariot races. For the Romans, this was not a minor pastime. Chariot racing was an obsession. The drivers competed at enormous speeds and crashes could be catastrophic. The ancient races were so dangerous that a wreck could resemble a shipwreck, with chariots overturning, horses collapsing, and drivers becoming trapped in the wreckage. Some drivers even wrapped reins around their bodies, creating the terrifying possibility that a crash could drag them to their deaths. But surviving such races could make a driver extraordinarily wealthy. One successful charioteer could accumulate enough wealth to become a celebrity in Roman society. The crowd was just as passionate as the competitors. Romans divided themselves among racing factions, most famously the blues, greens, reds, and whites. These were more than simple sports teams. Loyalty to a faction could become part of a person's identity, and the intense rivalry could spill into violence. The scale of the circus reveals something important about Rome. A city of more than 1 million people needed ways to bring enormous crowds together. The Romans had developed the architecture, organization, and political culture necessary to do exactly that, but the circus was built around speed and competition. Another arena would be built around something far darker. The Colosseum was smaller than the Circus Maximus, with a capacity of roughly 50,000 spectators, but its purpose was more brutal. Here, violence was not an unfortunate consequence of entertainment. Violence was the entertainment. For centuries, the arena hosted executions, animal hunts, and gladiatorial combat. Gladiators fought for survival, while criminals, prisoners, and enslaved people could be forced into spectacles that ended in death. Animals were brought from different parts of the empire and placed into the arena as part of the spectacle. Lions from Africa, bears from northern regions, elephants, and many other animals could become part of the Roman appetite for entertainment. Ancient accounts describe enormous numbers of animals being killed during major games. The opening celebrations of the Colosseum under Emperor Titus were said to have lasted for 100 days, with thousands of animals reportedly slaughtered during the festivities. The numbers preserved in ancient sources must always be treated with care, but there is no doubt about the central reality. The Roman state possessed the resources to organize spectacles on a staggering scale, and what the audience saw above the arena was only part of the story. Beneath the wooden floor was a complex underground world known as the hypogeum. Corridors, rooms, equipment, and lifting mechanisms allowed animals and fighters to be moved into position. Elevators could raise them toward trapdoors in the arena floor. To the spectators, a wild animal could suddenly appear as though it had emerged from nowhere. Behind the illusion was an enormous machine operated by human labor. This was Rome's characteristic approach to spectacle. Nothing was left to chance if engineering could control it. The city did not merely want to entertain thousands of people. It wanted to overwhelm them. Yet Rome was not only a city of violence, it was also intensely religious. Temples filled its streets and religious ceremonies were woven into public life. Among the most remarkable surviving buildings is the Pantheon. The Pantheon was associated with all the gods, and the building that survives today is one of the greatest examples of Roman concrete construction. Its enormous dome spans roughly 43 meters and rises without the internal supports that a structure of that size might seem to require. At its center is the oculus, a circular opening through which light enters the building. Standing beneath that dome today means standing beneath a structure created almost 2,000 years ago. The building's survival is extraordinary precisely because so many other Roman structures did not survive. Over centuries, temples were dismantled, materials were reused, and buildings were transformed. The Pantheon survived in large part because it was converted into a Christian church in late antiquity. Its influence continued long after the Roman Empire disappeared. Architects centuries later looked to Roman forms when creating monumental domes in public buildings. The Pantheon therefore became more than a surviving Roman monument. It became part of the architectural vocabulary of the world that followed Rome. But the Pantheon was not necessarily the most sacred structure in the ancient city. For that distinction, Rome looked toward Capitoline Hill and the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the temple stood above the Forum and occupied a position of enormous symbolic importance. Victorious Roman generals could end their triumphal processions here after returning from successful campaigns. They arrived with soldiers, prisoners, and captured wealth, transforming military conquest into a public ceremony of Roman power. The message was powerful. The empire conquered territory through military force, but victory was presented to the gods and celebrated by the city. Military power, religion, and political authority were all connected. The Temple of Jupiter stood for centuries, but unlike the Pantheon, it did not survive intact. Fires repeatedly damaged and destroyed it. Today, very little of the original structure remains. This contrast is a reminder that ancient Rome was never frozen in time. Buildings were destroyed, rebuilt, expanded, altered, and sometimes completely lost. And while the emperors worried about religious legitimacy and public spectacle, they also had a more immediate concern: staying alive. The Roman state had traditionally been cautious about having armies inside the city itself. Rome's political culture was deeply shaped by the fear of military power being turned inward. Yet emperors needed protection, and that need produced one of the most dangerous institutions in the capital, the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorians were elite soldiers who served as the emperor's personal guard. At their height, their numbers could reach around 10,000. They were better paid than ordinary soldiers and enjoyed privileged access to the political center of the empire. Their headquarters, the Castra Praetoria, was a massive fortified complex outside the traditional city center. Its walls were not designed primarily to protect Rome from a foreign army. They housed the men whose job was to protect the emperor, and that created a contradiction that would repeatedly haunt Roman politics. The emperor had brought an elite military force close to himself for protection, but that same force had the ability to influence imperial succession. The Praetorian Guard participated in political violence, supported and removed emperors, and became involved in the extraordinary events of AD 193, when the imperial throne was effectively offered to the highest bidder after the murder of Pertinax. The emperor therefore had to look in two directions at once. Beyond the borders were foreign enemies and rebellious provinces. Inside the capital were soldiers powerful enough to determine who sat on the throne. Yet while emperors worried about the loyalty of their guards, ordinary Romans faced a much more basic problem: water. More than 1 million people cannot survive without an enormous and reliable water supply. Rome solved this problem through an extensive aqueduct network that carried water from distant sources into the city. The Aqua Claudia, one of the great aqueducts of Rome, stretched for roughly 69 kilometers from its source toward the capital. In places, its channels were carried across massive stone arches rising many meters above the ground. These structures were not decorative monuments, they were infrastructure. The principle behind them was remarkably simple: gravity. Water was carefully guided along a controlled gradient, allowing it to travel toward Rome without pumps. The Romans understood that if the slope was calculated correctly, water could move enormous distances under its own weight. The result was one of the greatest urban water systems of the ancient world. Water could reach fountains, baths, private buildings, and other facilities across the city. Aqueducts transformed the possibilities of urban life, but water alone could not solve Rome's biggest problem: where would all those people live? For the emperors, the answer could be enormous villas and palaces. For ordinary Romans, it was often the insula. The insulae were multi-story apartment buildings that housed the majority of the urban population. Some rose 5 or 6 stories. They were the ancient city's high-rise housing, created by necessity because Rome had limited space and an enormous population. For the people living in them, life could be cramped and dangerous. Rooms could be small, upper floors were cheaper but harder to reach. Running water was not always available inside individual apartments, and cooking facilities could be limited. Fire was a constant threat in a city where buildings were crowded together, and construction materials could include large amounts of wood. Building collapses were another danger. As Rome grew upward, authorities eventually introduced regulations intended to control building height and improve safety, but the very existence of these rules reveals the scale of the problem. Rome had become so densely populated that it had encountered a challenge familiar to modern cities: how to fit enormous numbers of people into limited urban space. And this is where the image of ancient Rome begins to change. The city was not simply a collection of marble monuments surrounded by empty streets. It was crowded, it was noisy, it was busy. It was full of shops, workshops, apartments, traffic, arguments, commerce, smoke, and people moving constantly from one part of the city to another. Every morning, millions of small activities helped keep the enormous machine running. One important center of that activity was Trajan's Market. Built into the slope of a hill, the complex contained numerous shops and administrative spaces arranged across several levels. A Roman could find goods arriving from different parts of the empire: spices from the east, fish from coastal regions, wine, olive oil, fabrics, pottery, and countless other products. This was more than a shopping district. It was evidence of the economic system behind Roman power. The empire controlled territories across enormous distances, and goods moved through roads, ports, rivers, warehouses, and markets until they eventually reached consumers in Rome. The ordinary objects of daily life could therefore connect a Roman citizen to regions hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. The city at the center of the empire depended upon the empire itself. Then, after a long day of commerce and work, many Romans had another place to go: the public baths. The baths of Trajan covered an enormous area and could accommodate thousands of people. Bathing was not something Romans necessarily rushed through. It could occupy hours of the day. There were spaces for exercise, pools, hot rooms, and cold plunges. People met friends there, they discussed politics, they conducted business, they exchanged gossip, they ate, relaxed, and socialized. The baths therefore functioned as much more than places of hygiene. They were public social institutions. And here the aqueduct system became visible again. The water carried into Rome from distant sources could eventually flow into these enormous bathing complexes. Engineering that began many kilometers away ended in the daily lives of ordinary citizens. This is the point where the different parts of Rome begin to connect. The aqueducts were not isolated engineering projects. The apartments were not isolated buildings. The markets were not isolated commercial spaces. The baths were not isolated public facilities. The arenas were not isolated entertainment venues. Together they formed a system. Rome needed water because it had an enormous population. It needed housing because millions of people lived there. It needed markets because those people needed food and goods. It needed baths and public spaces because such a large population required places to gather. It needed entertainment because mass spectacles helped define Roman public life. It needed temples and forums because religion and politics were central to the identity of the city. And it needed soldiers because the political system that controlled the empire depended ultimately upon force. That is what makes ancient Rome so remarkable. The astonishing thing was not that Romans could build one enormous monument. Civilizations had built enormous temples before. The astonishing thing was that Rome could build an entire enormous city and keep it functioning. Imagine the daily requirements. More than 1 million people needed food, they needed water, they needed housing, they needed places to work, they needed roads and streets, they needed markets, they needed public facilities. They needed political institutions, they needed entertainment, and they needed an enormous administrative system to coordinate all of it. Every aqueduct, apartment, bath, market, temple, arena, and palace was only one piece of a much larger structure. This is why the familiar image of Rome can be misleading. When people think of ancient Rome, they often imagine the Colosseum, the Forum, marble statues, and toga-clad senators. Those things were real, but they represent only the most visible part of the city. Beneath that image was something much more complicated. There were workers carrying goods through crowded streets. Merchants selling imported products, families living several stories above the ground, water flowing through channels from distant springs, bath complexes filled with thousands of people, administrators managing the empire's enormous resources, soldiers guarding the emperor, priests maintaining ancient religious traditions, charioteers risking their lives before massive crowds. And above all of them stood the emperor, living in a palace that represented the wealth and power of a state stretching across 3 continents. Rome had become a world city. Its population alone would have been extraordinary, but population was only part of the achievement. The Romans had developed ways of organizing density. The insulae allowed large numbers of people to live vertically. The aqueducts allowed water to travel across huge distances. The markets concentrated commerce. The baths concentrated social life. The forums concentrated politics and public ceremony. The arenas concentrated mass entertainment. The temples concentrated religious identity. The roads and imperial administration connected all of it to territories far beyond Italy. Rome had essentially confronted a problem that would define cities thousands of years later. How do you make an enormous number of people live together in one place? The Romans did not solve the problem perfectly, far from it. Their city was dangerous. Fires could destroy neighborhoods. Buildings could collapse. Inequality was enormous. The wealthy lived in luxury while ordinary people crowded into apartment blocks. The entertainment system depended upon violence and death. Enslavement was deeply embedded in Roman society. Political power could be ruthless, and the same institutions that maintained order could also produce instability. Rome was not a modern city. But in its scale and complexity, it was something extraordinary. It had already encountered the challenges of the megacity, and some of the solutions it developed would remain recognizable long after the empire itself disappeared. The apartment building did not disappear as a concept. The stadium did not disappear. The public bath and public gathering space did not disappear. Concrete did not disappear. Large-scale water infrastructure did not disappear. Cities continued to evolve and modern technology transformed what was possible, but the fundamental problems remained strangely familiar. How should millions of people be housed? How should water reach them? Where should they trade? Where should they gather? How should public spaces be designed? How can a city create places where enormous populations can experience entertainment, politics, religion, and community? Modern cities have answered these questions in radically different ways, but the questions themselves are ancient. Rome had already been asking them. That is why the surviving buildings can sometimes be deceptive. The ruins may look incomplete, but the civilization behind them was anything but simple. The Colosseum was not merely a stone arena. It required engineering, labor, logistics, performers, animals, security, and an audience numbering in the tens of thousands. The aqueduct was not merely a row of arches. It was the visible section of a water system stretching across the landscape. The baths were not merely swimming pools. They were social institutions supported by massive infrastructure. The insula was not merely an apartment block. It was a response to extreme urban density. The Forum was not merely a collection of ruins. It was the political center of a state whose decisions reached across continents. And the imperial palace was not merely a residence. It was a physical expression of a political system in which the emperor had become the center of Roman power. Seen this way, Rome becomes much larger than its ruins suggest. The city that stands today is only the surviving skeleton. The ancient city was filled with movement. It was filled with voices. It was filled with commerce, ceremonies, arguments, celebrations, religious rituals, political ambitions, fear, wealth, poverty, and millions of individual lives. The stones that remain are fragments of a much larger reality. And perhaps that is the most surprising thing about ancient Rome. It was not simply that Romans built buildings that were enormous for their time. It was that they created an urban environment in which enormous numbers of people could live together for generations. The city was constantly changing, constantly rebuilding itself, constantly adapting to the pressures created by its own success. Rome had once been a settlement vulnerable enough to be burned and sacked. Centuries later, it had become the center of one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever known. The Forum represented its political heart. The temples represented its religious identity. The palace represented imperial authority, the arenas represented mass spectacle, the aqueducts represented engineering, the markets represented economic power, the apartment buildings represented population density, the baths represented everyday social life. None of these things alone explains Rome. Together they do, because the true scale of ancient Rome cannot be measured by one monument. It has to be measured by the system. A city capable of supporting more than 1 million people required an extraordinary amount of organization. Every day, that system had to function again. Water had to arrive, food had to circulate, buildings had to be maintained. Markets had to operate, public spaces had to serve thousands, officials had to administer the city, soldiers had to protect the political order, and somewhere inside all of it, ordinary people had to wake up, work, eat, argue, trade, bathe, worship, celebrate, and return home. That is what made Rome different. It did not simply become big. It learned how to operate at enormous scale, and when the Roman Empire eventually disappeared, the city did not take that knowledge with it entirely. Its monuments survived in fragments. Its engineering survived in structures that still stand. Its architecture inspired generations of builders. Its urban ideas continue to echo through later cities. The modern world did not simply inherit Roman buildings. It inherited the memory of a civilization that had already discovered how difficult it was to make a huge city work. Rome's greatest achievement then may not have been the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Forum, or even the aqueducts. It may have been the city itself, a city that began as a vulnerable settlement, a city that survived destruction, a city that expanded beyond anything its earliest inhabitants could have imagined. A city where more than 1 million people could exist within the same enormous urban machine. 2,000 years later, the ruins can make Rome seem distant and almost unreal, but beneath those ruins is a surprisingly familiar story. People needed homes, they needed water, they needed markets. They needed public spaces, they needed entertainment, they needed political institutions, they needed ways to live together. Rome faced those problems on a scale that few ancient cities had ever approached, and that is why ancient Rome was bigger than you think, not simply because it was large. Not simply because its buildings were enormous, but because long before the skyscrapers of modern cities, Rome had already confronted the challenge of creating a city for a population on a massive scale. The empire is gone, the emperors are gone, the legions are gone. The crowds that once filled the Circus Maximus have disappeared, the sacred flame of Vesta has gone out, the voices of senators have fallen silent, but the question Rome was forced to answer remains with humanity. How do you make 1 million people live together in one city? Rome answered that question with stone, concrete, water, roads, markets, apartments, baths, temples, arenas, and an extraordinary system of organization. And for centuries afterward, the world continued building on the foundations of that answer.